So thank you for accepting our invitation for this interview today. So who are you?
I'm Searle Kochberg, and I am the subject leader on the MSc Film and TV, and also teach on undergraduate studies as well.
How would you define empathy?
Empathy is an ability for a person to put themselves in the shoes of another person. To actually, it's more than sympathy, it's more than feeling sorry or liking a person. It's about feeling what another person feels.
Why do we need to empathize as human beings?
Because if we don't empathize, we tend to see everything from our point of view, and we tend to be rather narcissistic. And in the case of film, if you don't empathize with the character, you objectify the characters all the time. So the cinematic experience tends to be very voyeuristic.
I will go to the question of the film later. I want to ask you more specifically what makes people, in your opinion, relate to other people's stories?
We need to know who the people are. We need to understand why they feel the way they do. We have to understand why they do what they do. We don't have to like them, but we have to understand them. And we have to, in some way, be able to relate to the experiences they're going through.
And another question on it. You think that the interest for the other people's stories comes because we just want to know about the others?
Of
Where
course,
does this interest come
of
from?
course, one has a voyeuristic interest in other people's lives and stories and whatever. But I think that it also comes from a kind of narcissistic element in human nature that we try and project our own selves onto most situations we look at. So we tend to want to understand ourselves through the experiences of other people. So it's a bit of both.
So my question now is, what is the purpose of empathy in film?
In film, empathy helps us to feel more attached to the story, basically. Stories are always told through characters, particularly in mainstream entertainment. And they're a vehicle for us to project our own selves into the story, but they're also a vehicle for us to voyeuristically enjoy other people and their situations. So it's fundamental to our enjoyment of a story, really.
Let's go a little bit deeper. How does this empathy manifest in film form and narrative?
Okay. In film form, we will use point of view techniques a lot of the time, or subjective techniques, so that the audience feels they are embodying the the being of the character. So what we see on the screen may reflect what we would see or approximate to what we would see. That's called a point of view shot. Or we can use things like voiceovers. We can use handheld camera to suggest how we would feel if we were in the situation of the character. We can use music to make us feel something whenever we're feeling something
So these
for
are
the character.
the tools that we
Yeah,
use at the form.
at the form.
And the narrative?
The narrative, we would make sure that there was something about the character that we could relate to, the social, the demographic makeup of the character, the behavior of the character, the circumstance of the character, that there was something in the story and their trials and tribulations, what they want, what they need, how they think, that we can somehow relate to.
Are both of them important for a
Just
filmmaker?
desperately important. Desperately important. Um, One of the great tools of film is that it affects a kind of psychological realism. And that's what you're talking about, really. Through empathy, we achieve a psychological realism with our characters. Now, a lot of artists don't want us to feel that way because they want us to be more objective and more critical of the stories. So people like Brecht, people like Godard, will use various techniques to shatter our empathy. And Brecht talked about anti-dramatic theatre. What he was talking about, what he meant by dramatic, was psychological realism.
Apart from the arts field, when do we need to be more empathetic, or when do we need to be more impartial and objective?
I think that perhaps we're using art in too narrow a way. I consider artwork work that is independent and challenging of the mainstream dominant culture. I think we need to empathize when we need to understand what triggers certain situations in our society. And often characters will facilitate that for us. We need to be more objective. I've just watched a 10-hour documentary on O.J. Simpson. And O.J. Simpson was an extremely handsome, attractive man, and the subject of one of the most important court cases in the history of the 20th century in America around race and injustice and the justice system. And that documentary needed it, on the one hand, to make us empathize with him, to sort of be seduced by him. And on the other hand, it needed to make us stand away from him because his seductive powers ultimately led to the murder of his ex-wife, and her boyfriend. So the documentary has this job of both wanting us to empathize, but always wanting us to be slightly objective and slightly critical, because ultimately good documentary, is about social reality. And social reality means being more outside of a situation. If you're inside a situation, which has its advantages too, because you can understand a community much more intimately, but if you're slightly outside and more objective, you can view the situation with slightly less passionate eyes. And I think that, so both are necessary, I think, in work that attempts to be a little critical, if you like.
So in your opinion, do you believe that probably the critical view does not derive from empathy?
Oh, that's a difficult one. No, because, a lot of my work is highly subjective and highly empathetic, and yet it's critical. I think that subjectivity and empathy have a role, and a more critical sense also has a role. It really depends on the context of the work you're doing. I think that what you mustn't be when you're a filmmaker is you mustn't become seduced by your characters. If you're seduced by them, you can't actually reflect on who they are and what they are. So in that sense, stepping back, and if you want to call that being objective, fine. But I think you need to be able to not be in love with your characters. If you're in love with them, all you do is reproduce certain cliches. You cannot stand outside. So empathy is a very powerful and constructive tool, but it's also quite a dangerous tool if it's not understood properly.
As I can see, different levels of narcissism are become the obstacle through this process.
They are.
Of the viewer, of the maker.
But they're also positive too, because to draw the audience into something, they must in some way relate to what they're looking at, I believe. If they feel totally alienated by what they're looking at, you've lost them. Well, in fact, you never had them. So you need to be rather playful and sophisticated about it. And on the one hand, draw them in, and then on the other hand, allow them the space to be slightly critical of what they're looking at.
That's quite difficult.
It is quite difficult. And you have to play with different strategies, to achieve that.
Would you like to add any further personal experiences or ideas on this topic? Probably of your manipulation of camera or narrative?
Well, I'm a great believer in the long duration tracking shots and a rather wider shots than the close-up. I think I like the audiences to both relate to the characters very deeply and yet to understand and allow themselves a little bit of a objective distance from what's going on. So for me, the tracking shot, and it's a wider shot and a moving shot, it's got energy, it's got dynamism, it's got all the intimacy that you ascribe to shooting a person, and yet it remains slightly detached.
And then on narrative?
Narrative, my experiences are...
Did you have ever any difficulty?
I like working with people who have their own narrative. That's my solution to what you're talking about. Because if I write the narrative, I'm going to tidy everything up and I'm going to find a solution and I'm going to make sure that my characters are completely understandable. If they write the narrative, often the narratives they write are ambivalent, they're contradictory, and I like working with real people because real people don't come in nice little boxes. They have
their own stories.
They have their own stories which don't add up in that classic narrative way. So you end up going down blind alleys at times, you end up with no answers at times. I like that.
Thank you for your time.